Berlin, January 1945. The city was collapsing under the relentless thunder of Soviet artillery, yet amid the chaos, one man walked calmly through the frozen streets carrying a false Swiss passport and a Leica camera. His name was Charles Wentworth, a 34-year-old MI6 operative fluent in German, trained at Camp X in Canada, and now deep behind enemy lines. His mission was simple on paper: make contact with a German physicist codenamed Archer, who had information vital to Britain's future. But as with all things in the dying days of the Third Reich, nothing in Berlin was simple anymore. By then, Berlin was no longer a city. It was a ruin clinging to a delusion. Buildings were skeletons of brick and ash. Civilians shuffled through rubble searching for bread or shelter, while columns of Volkssturm militia, some barely in uniform, marched past with weapons older than themselves. Wentworth moved among them unnoticed, wrapped in a heavy overcoat. His identification papers marked with Swiss diplomatic seals forged by MI6’s Q section. He had arrived 2 nights earlier by train from neutral Sweden, slipping through Rostock under the cover of a Red Cross consignment. His first stop was a safe house near Tiergarten, maintained by a dwindling network of German anti-Nazi sympathizers known to MI6 as Die Glock. Inside the dimly lit basement, Wentworth met his local contact, an engineer named Otto Reimer, who had once worked at Siemens before being forced into hiding for aiding Allied POWs. Reimer passed him a coded message written on cigarette paper: "Contact Archer at the British Embassy ruins, midnight, January 21st. It was an address deep in Soviet bombing territory, nearly suicidal to reach. Wentworth simply nodded. "If the man's still alive," Reimer whispered, "he won't be for long." The risk was immense. The Gestapo had grown desperate, rooting out spies and deserters with increasing brutality. Rumors spread that Heinrich Mahler, the head of the Gestapo himself, had ordered a special detachment to hunt foreign agents believed to be operating in the capital. Wentworth knew that if captured, his forged papers would not save him. Yet the information Archer promised, technical documents on advanced German rocketry, was too critical to ignore. Britain's Scientific Intelligence Division had learned of a weapon project beyond the V2, and the Allies were racing to secure it before the Soviets did. In his final field report before going silent, Wentworth described his feelings on the eve of the meeting. "Berlin feels like a grave waiting to be filled. Every window watches, every sound echoes like betrayal." His words, later found in a burned file recovered from MI6 archives, captured the haunting tension of those last days. At midnight, Wentworth reached the ruins of the old British Embassy on Wilhelmstrasse. Snow drifted through broken windows and onto marble floors scorched black by bombing raids. His footsteps echoed faintly in the hall where British diplomats had once gathered for receptions before the war. There, in the flickering light of a candle, a shadow moved, a man in a tattered overcoat carrying a satchel. "Archer," Wentworth whispered. The figure hesitated, then nodded. He handed over the satchel, whispering, "They are coming for me. For all of us." Before Wentworth could question him, the silence shattered. A truck's engine roared outside, followed by shouts in German, "Gestapo." Archer fled into the darkness. Wentworth barely escaped through a side corridor, crawling through debris into a nearby sewer tunnel. His Leica camera clattered against the stone, denting its casing, but the satchel remained in his grip. Hours later, he reached his safe house soaked and shivering. When Reimer opened the door, Wentworth handed him the satchel. Inside were blueprints marked Aggregate 10, a possible successor to the V2 rocket, and a half-burned list of names. "This," Wentworth said between breaths, "is what they'll kill for." But Reimer warned that the Gestapo would soon trace the meeting. That night, the safe house was attacked. Neighbors reported gunfire and flames rising from the basement. When Allied intelligence arrived weeks later, they found the building reduced to ash. No bodies were recovered. The only trace of Wentworth was a scrap of paper found in the rubble, part of a coded note written in invisible ink. "The city burns, but the secret must survive." For decades, MI6 kept the mission classified under Operation Eclipse, Berlin Phase. In official records, Charles Wentworth was listed as missing in action. No photograph, no burial. Just a name among hundreds lost in the final chaos of war. Yet whispers among intelligence officers persisted, that somewhere in those last days of Berlin, he had uncovered something extraordinary, something both sides wanted buried. The city would fall within months, but the mystery of the man who walked alone through its ruins had only begun. By early February 1945, British intelligence had begun to panic. The last radio signal from Agent Charles Wentworth had been received on January 22, a single-burst transmission intercepted over Denmark, its final words distorted by static. Package secured. Berlin compromised. After that, silence. MI6 Section 5, responsible for counterintelligence in occupied Europe, scrambled to piece together what had gone wrong. In a dim office at 54 Broadway, London, a team of exhausted analysts gathered around a map of Berlin covered in pins and coded notations. Their task was to find a man who no longer officially existed. The operation was now under the direction of Colonel Sir Reginald Haversham, an MI6 veteran who had overseen covert evacuations during Operation Overlord. If he's alive, Haversham told his staff, he'll try to reach Tiergarten or Potsdamer Platz. If he's not, then God help us all if that satchel falls into the wrong hands. The British weren't the only ones searching. Reports filtering through from the OSS station in Bern indicated that the Gestapo had raided several suspected safe houses across the Tiergarten district in late January. Witnesses spoke of brutal interrogations, of men dragged from basements and never seen again. Among the captured was a known MI6 courier, Evelyn Ward, a 27-year-old wireless operator who had served in Cairo and Paris before being reassigned to Berlin's underground network in December 1944. Ward was one of MI6's best, trained in ciphers, fluent in German, and equipped with a miniature Type 3 Mark II radio transmitter disguised as a camera case. Her task had been to maintain intermittent contact with Die Glock, the resistance group helping Wentworth move through Berlin. But on January 28, she was captured while attempting to cross the Spree River near the Reichstag, disguised as a nurse escorting wounded civilians. According to post-war accounts from Soviet investigators, she was turned over to the Gestapo and interrogated at Prinz-Albrechtstrasse, the notorious headquarters of the secret state police. The interrogation records were thought destroyed when Berlin fell, but fragments resurfaced decades later in an East German archive. In one brittle file, a Gestapo officer's note reads, "Female courier confirmed connection to British intelligence. Mentioned Archer and aggregate weapon. Insists on meeting with contact, CW, believes information must reach allies before Soviets." The file ends abruptly, stamped with the date February 2, 1945. Back in London, the news of Ward's disappearance hit MI6 hard. Haversham ordered a contingency operation, codename Nightglass, to track any mention of Wentworth or the Aggregate 10 project through OSS intercepts and resistance channels. Field agents in Stockholm and Copenhagen were instructed to follow all trails, no matter how faint. What they found only deepened the mystery. A message intercepted by the Swedish Security Service on February 9 contained an encrypted signature matching Wentworth's transmission key, but it originated not from Berlin, but from Magdeburg, over 120 kilometers away. The content was garbled and incomplete, referencing archives relocated south, and new orders impossible to obey. The transmission ended with the line, "The city is dying. I may be next." Historians have long debated the meaning of that message. Was Wentworth still alive, attempting to reach Allied lines? Or had someone else, perhaps an enemy agent, used his radio code to mislead MI6? Evelyn Ward's interrogation files suggest she believed Wentworth had stumbled upon a larger secret, one that threatened both Nazi and Allied post-war plans. "He found something," she reportedly said under questioning. "Something worth more than the bomb." The pressure on MI6 mounted as Soviet forces advanced toward Berlin. Every passing week made recovery less likely. In one declassified memo dated March 3, 1945, a senior intelligence officer wrote, "If Wentworth's information is accurate, the implications for European security are immense. The Americans are already moving to secure German scientific assets. We cannot be left behind." To the men in London, it was more than a missing agent. It was a race against history itself. Behind the political rhetoric of Allied unity, a quieter struggle had begun, to control the secrets of Nazi science before the world even realized what was at stake. Ward's fate remains uncertain. Some historians believe she was executed in late February, though no record of her death has ever been found. Others claim she survived and was transferred to a Soviet-controlled facility after the city's fall. Either way, her story intertwines irrevocably with Wentworth's disappearance. One line from a debriefing transcript, allegedly dictated by an OSS liaison officer in 1946, captures the haunting uncertainty of those days. "We were hunting a ghost in a dying city. Every lead ended in smoke, every whisper turned to ash. As Berlin crumbled, so too did the trail of MI6's lost agent." But from the ashes of the capital, new rumors began to spread. Of a cache of documents hidden somewhere beneath the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, containing the names of scientists, the blueprints of a new weapon, and a clue to what Charles Wentworth may have died protecting. By March 1945, Berlin was no longer a city. It was a fortress under siege. Soviet artillery encircled the suburbs, and Allied bombers pounded what remained of its infrastructure. Amid this inferno, one name continued to haunt both British and American intelligence reports: Charles Wentworth. Though presumed dead, traces of his operations surfaced in unexpected places. Intercepted signals, half-burned files, whispered testimony from captured German officers. The most compelling clue emerged from the account of a young woman, known in British files only as E.W. Evelyn Ward. According to Soviet archival fragments later uncovered in the 1990s, Ward survived her Gestapo captivity long enough to be transferred to a makeshift holding center near Alexanderplatz, where prisoners were interrogated for information valuable to the collapsing Reich. A Russian translator's note describes her as calm, pale, and unwavering. During one session, she reportedly mentioned documents that could change the balance of power before peace is even declared. The interrogations revealed fragments of a story that would confound historians for decades. Ward claimed Wentworth had discovered evidence of a parallel German weapons project, something beyond the V-2 rockets that had terrorized London. The name she used, scrawled in the corner of a confiscated notebook, was Project Morgenrot, Project Dawn. According to her notes, it involved a theoretical propulsion system combining chemical and electrical acceleration, something that could have revolutionized warfare had it been completed. But there was another layer to the mystery. Ward insisted that Archer, the physicist Wentworth was sent to extract, had confided that British and American intelligence already knew of Morgenrot before the agent's arrival. He said the Allies were not just hunting the scientists, she told her captors. They were hunting the research itself. It was an accusation that hinted at a shadow war within the war, a race not simply to defeat Germany, but to seize its knowledge before the Soviets could. What gave her words credibility were the locations she described. She mentioned a bunker complex near Kummersdorf, south of Berlin, the same test site where Wernher von Braun's team had experimented with early rocket prototypes. Declassified MI6 reconnaissance photos confirmed that a small detachment of engineers had been stationed there as late as February 1945. The British knew of the site, but few outside a select circle understood its true significance. In one surviving interrogation summary, Ward's statement is recorded verbatim. He went there to find Archer, but what he found instead frightened him. He said, "They'll never let this see the light of day." The human side of the story is just as haunting. Ward, only 27, had served through the North African campaign and the Allied push into France. She was no stranger to danger. Yet, in the ruins of Berlin, she had come face to face with the darker machinery of wartime intelligence, where truth and allegiance blurred under the weight of necessity. "In war," she once wrote in a personal letter never meant to be seen, "we trade pieces of our humanity for victory, and pretend the cost is temporary." Those words, preserved in MI6's post-war archives, encapsulate the moral struggle that defined not only her mission but Wentworth's as well. They were part of a generation of operatives who fought not for medals or recognition, but for shadows, missions that would never make headlines or history books. When the Soviets reached Berlin in April, the Alexanderplatz detention center was destroyed. Ward's fate remains unknown. Some witnesses later claimed to have seen a British woman among a group of prisoners evacuated east toward Frankfurt an der Oder. Others say she was executed when Gestapo units abandoned the city. What is certain is that by the war's end, no trace of her remained. Her diary fragments, however, survived, smuggled out by a Russian translator who defected to the West in 1948. Among her final notes was one chilling line: "He found something worth more than the bomb, and now they're all looking for him." That single sentence ignited a post-war debate within the intelligence community. What had Wentworth truly discovered? Was Project Dawn a real scientific breakthrough, or a disinformation campaign engineered by the Germans to lure Allied spies? Some argued that the blueprints recovered from the embassy ruins were part of the same operation, a decoy to mislead the Allies. Others believed Wentworth stumbled upon evidence of pre-war Allied collaboration with German scientists, a politically explosive revelation that would have to be buried at all costs. A British intelligence historian, Sir Alastair Dunn, once summarized the enigma in his 1979 memoir. Wentworth's silence became more dangerous than any secret he might have spoken. As the Red Army closed in on the heart of the Reich, the fate of MI6's lost agent, and the truth behind his final discovery, remained hidden beneath the rubble. The Allies would soon divide Berlin, but the secrets buried in its ashes would outlast victory itself. And somewhere, among the ruins of Kummersdorf, the first pieces of that truth waited to be unearthed. The war in Europe was drawing to its end, but for MI6, the hunt for Charles Wentworth was only beginning. By May 1945, as Allied forces swept through Germany, intelligence officers working under Operation Eclipse, the mission to secure Nazi scientific research before the Soviets, were combing the countryside for any trace of Project Dawn. Among the men dispatched into the ruins was Major William "Bill" Mercer of the British Scientific Intelligence Division, a veteran field officer known for his methodical precision. His team arrived in Berlin just days after the city's surrender. The devastation was beyond comprehension. Entire districts flattened, smoke rising from the Reich Chancellery, civilians wandering through streets filled with corpses and burned-out armor. Berlin was not conquered, Mercer later wrote in his after-action report. It simply ceased to exist. Mercer's orders were explicit: locate any surviving German physicists associated with experimental propulsion or energy systems. But quietly, another directive had been added from MI6 headquarters. Investigate reports of a missing agent, codename Wentworth, last seen in Berlin January 1945. The two objectives soon intertwined. In a ruined government building near Potsdamer Platz, Mercer's men recovered a cache of partially burned documents. Among them were references to Project Morgenrot, the same name Evelyn Ward had mentioned under interrogation, and several schematic diagrams marked Aggregate 10. In the margins of one page, a single English phrase was scribbled in pencil: "Not for them." The handwriting matched samples of Wentworth's field notes. It was the first hard evidence that Wentworth had survived the Gestapo raid and continued operating for at least several days after. But the deeper Mercer's team probed, the stranger the trail became. They found no body, no witnesses, only a string of coded notes and safe houses burned to the ground. One report from a German resistance member suggested that a British officer had been seen heading south toward Kummersdorf in late January, carrying what looked like technical documents sealed in a metal tube. When Mercer reached Kummersdorf in June 1945, the site was already under Soviet control. The Red Army had cordoned off the entire area, denying Allied access. A Soviet colonel, when pressed, reportedly told Mercer, "The British man you are looking for, we have his papers, not his bones." That phrase would later appear in a secret MI6 memorandum dated July 12, 1945. Eclipse objectives compromised. Possible Soviet possession of classified British material. Agent Wentworth presumed captured or eliminated. Yet no confirmation ever came. The files remained sealed for over 3 decades, until the 1978 declassification of several Operation Eclipse documents brought the case back into public attention. Among the most striking was a letter from an MI6 field officer to Director Stuart Menzies, stating, "Evidence suggests Agent Wentworth's disappearance was not due to enemy action but internal interference. Certain American OSS operatives were aware of his movements before Berlin fell. It was a revelation that shocked even seasoned intelligence historians. Could Wentworth have been betrayed, not by the Germans, but by the Allies themselves? During the chaotic final months of the war, MI6, OSS, and Soviet intelligence were all competing to secure German scientists, and loyalties were often blurred. Operation Paperclip, the American program that recruited Nazi scientists, was already underway in secret. If Wentworth had discovered information that both sides wanted, his disappearance could have been intentional. One declassified diary entry from an MI6 technical officer stationed in Paris that same year reads, "Wentworth knew too much about both sides. His silence is useful." For modern readers, the revelation is sobering. The intelligence war didn't end with Hitler's death. It merely changed names and borders. In many ways, the Cold War began not in 1947, but in the smoldering streets of Berlin, when men like Charles Wentworth vanished into the shadows of history. As for Mercer, he returned to London disillusioned. He filed his final report in December 1945, concluding with a single line that remains one of the most haunting in MI6's wartime record. "We secured the knowledge, but lost the man who warned us of its cost." No official acknowledgement of Wentworth's mission was ever made. His family received a generic telegram stating he had been lost in service. Yet within MI6, whispers persisted that Wentworth had not died in Berlin at all, but had been taken east, possibly exchanged in a covert deal with Soviet intelligence. Whether by betrayal or by necessity, MI6's lost agent became both a symbol and a warning. A reminder that in espionage, truth is the first casualty of victory. As Europe celebrated peace, a quiet file marked CW, classified beyond release, remained locked in the archives, its final page ending with a chilling annotation, "Status, unresolved." Summer 1946. Berlin was divided, broken into occupation zones ruled by victors who now eyed one another with suspicion. Between the ruins of the Reichstag and the smoldering remains of Potsdamer Platz, a new kind of war was beginning. A war of intelligence, of secrets buried beneath rubble. In the British sector, a small unit of the newly formed Intelligence Bureau of the Control Commission for Germany began combing through the wreckage of what the Nazis had left behind. Their unofficial objective was clear: to find any trace of Agent Charles Wentworth, MI6's man who had vanished months before the war's end. At the center of this renewed investigation was Lieutenant Commander Harold Finch, a former Royal Navy cryptanalyst turned intelligence officer. Finch had been stationed in Berlin since the Allied occupation began, working closely with American counterparts under the Office of Strategic Services, though by 1946, those same Americans were quietly transforming into what would soon be known as the CIA. Finch was handed a stack of post-war Soviet interrogation reports that mentioned an unnamed British operative seen near the Reich Chancellery in the final days before Hitler's death. The Soviet report was maddeningly vague. The man was described as tall, wearing a dark overcoat, and in possession of English papers and technical drawings. What drew Finch's attention wasn't just the physical description. It was a name scrawled in the margin of one Soviet officer's summary: Wentworth. The misspelling was minor, but unmistakable. The trail led Finch through the devastated streets of central Berlin, where every ruin seemed to whisper fragments of the past. He spoke to locals, scavengers, and displaced persons who remembered the chaos of those final weeks. A former German orderly recalled seeing a foreigner, calm amidst the madness, standing near the entrance of the Reich Chancellery bunker complex. Another witness, a Russian interpreter assigned to the Soviet Fifth Shock Army, claimed the man had been escorted by two NKVD officers toward the Tiergarten area shortly after May 2, 1945. The British command initially dismissed these stories as confusion born of the city's collapse. But then came the discovery that would reignite the mystery. In late August, a Soviet truck carrying captured German documents overturned near the border of the British zone. Among the scattered papers was a weathered file stamped with the red wax seal of the NKVD. Inside was a fragment of a British field cipher, partially burned, bearing the code signature CW12. It was traced back to a frequency once assigned to Charles Wentworth's Berlin mission. The implications were staggering. If the Soviets had possession of his cipher sheet, it meant Wentworth, or at least his equipment, had survived the Gestapo and fallen into Soviet hands. But why had the NKVD never publicly acknowledged capturing a British spy? Finch's reports to London grew increasingly cautious. In a cable dated September 3, 1946, he wrote, "Evidence indicates CW may have been detained alive. Local Soviet liaison denies all knowledge. Their denials too quick to be believed." MI6's response, filed under Directive 47/Blackbird, instructed Finch to cease direct inquiries with Soviet personnel. The British government, now mired in post-war diplomacy, could not risk a confrontation over a single missing agent. Still, Finch pressed on. Working through unofficial channels, he obtained copies of Soviet prisoner manifests smuggled from a contact in the American sector. Among the names of engineers, scientists, and suspected spies relocated eastward in the summer of 1945, one entry stood out: unknown Englishman, technical specialist. Destination: Moscow, for evaluation. That vague entry was enough to feed a legend that has persisted ever since, that Wentworth had not perished in Berlin, but had been taken alive to Moscow. Some post-war intelligence officers claimed that the Soviets kept him under protection, using his knowledge of Allied intelligence methods during the early stages of the Cold War. Others believed he was executed once his usefulness expired. One British diplomat, Sir Peter Lawson, who later investigated wartime disappearances, summarized the mystery in a BBC interview decades later. "It was as if Berlin itself swallowed him whole. You could stand in the ruins where he last walked and feel the weight of silence." For Finch, the silence proved unbearable. His last known memo to MI6 headquarters, written in December 1946, contained a final line of resignation: "We no longer search for the man. We search for what his silence concealed." By the late 1940s, the Iron Curtain had fallen across Europe, and whatever truth lay behind Soviet lines was locked away with it. The official British stance remained unchanged: Agent Charles Wentworth, presumed dead, Berlin, January 1945. Yet the evidence told another story, a shadow narrative of capture, secrecy, and quiet erasure. As Berlin rebuilt itself brick by brick, the whispers of Operation Eclipse faded from official memory. But for those few in MI6 who had seen the files marked CW restricted, the case of the missing agent lingered like unfinished business. His disappearance was more than a wartime mystery. It was a reflection of the uneasy alliance that had won the war and immediately begun another. The war was over. But for those who served in the shadows, the peace would never come. By the 1970s, the story of Charles Wentworth had faded into the background of Cold War mythology, one of those whispered tales told in London's smoky intelligence clubs or among retired officers at the Travellers' Bar in Pall Mall. His file, long classified under Operation Eclipse, had gathered dust for over 3 decades. Then, in 1978, a Freedom of Information request by a historian researching British intelligence in occupied Germany forced MI6 to declassify fragments of post-war communications. What they revealed reawakened a mystery that had never truly died. The newly released materials included cables, interrogation reports, and a Soviet dossier acquired through a diplomatic exchange in 1964. Among them was a single cryptic reference that stunned researchers: British national, male, ex-operative, residing under protection near Moscow, 1946–47. Later transferred to unnamed facility. The description matched Wentworth's physical profile exactly. Though his name was redacted, the initials CW appeared repeatedly throughout the document. To historians, it was the closest thing to proof that Wentworth had survived the fall of Berlin. For MI6 veterans, it was confirmation of something they had suspected for years, that their lost agent had been taken east and silenced not by the Gestapo, but by the very allies they once trusted. A BBC investigative series in 1982 revisited the case, interviewing surviving officers who had worked under Operation Eclipse. Major Bill Mercer, then in his 80s, spoke publicly for the first time. His voice trembled as he recalled finding Wentworth's handwriting on those documents in 1945. "He was no fool," Mercer said. "He understood the science, the politics. And he knew something neither side wanted revealed. When asked if he believed Wentworth was still alive after the war, Mercer paused. Alive? Perhaps. But not free. Researchers began to speculate on what Wentworth might have discovered. Some pointed to Project Dawn, the mysterious propulsion research that had resurfaced in both Allied and Soviet archives. Others suggested he had uncovered evidence of pre-war cooperation between Western corporations and German scientists, a revelation that could have undermined the moral high ground of the post-war order. Whatever it was, it vanished with him. In 1991, after the Soviet Union collapsed, Western journalists gained access to newly opened KGB archives. In a remote file room of the Lubyanka, a British researcher named Dr. Helen Cartwright discovered a small, yellowing document labeled Operativnaya Dela, Inostrani Specialist 1946. Inside was a blurred photograph of a man in British civilian clothing, sitting at a desk, his face partially shadowed. The image was captioned in Russian, Karl Zuentvort, technical consultant. The date, August 1946. Cartwright's discovery reignited public fascination. Yet even she admitted, in later interviews, that the truth remained elusive. The Soviets documented everything, she said, except what mattered most. There's no record of his death, no record of his release. It's as if his file was intentionally erased after 1947. For MI6, the case was quietly reclassified as closed with anomalies. But within the intelligence community, the legend of Wentworth persisted, a story of loyalty, sacrifice, and the price of knowing too much. His coded messages, his final note, "The city burns, but the secret must survive," became the subject of documentaries and speculative books. Yet none offered certainty, only echoes. One historian writing in the Times summarized it best. Charles Wentworth stands as a monument to the vanishing point of wartime espionage, the moment when moral clarity dissolved into the fog of the Cold War. Today, at MI6 headquarters on the Thames, Wentworth's name is engraved on a small bronze plaque among those listed as missing in action. Visitors rarely notice it. But in the archives, his last surviving field photograph, taken before his mission to Berlin, shows a man in his mid-30s with calm eyes and a half-smile, unaware that he was about to walk into history's most dangerous secret. His fate remains unresolved. Was he captured? Was he silenced? Or did he choose exile over betrayal? The evidence points in all directions, and perhaps that is the point. As one intelligence veteran once remarked, in our line of work, disappearance is the purest form of truth. The mystery of MI6's lost agent in the heart of Berlin endures, not as a story of espionage alone, but as a reflection of an era when the line between hero and pawn blurred beyond recognition. And somewhere, buried deep in the archives of two nations, the final piece of his story still waits to be found.